We're here to talk about water reform here within New Zealand, and just as just a bit of background to water reform in New Zealand, there's three distinct pillars to the reform process within New Zealand. The first element is new regulation, and new regulation was passed into being through the Water Services Bill. So we have new, very clear water standards, and that's very clear within the new regulation that's been put in place. So that's already in place and already been done. The second element of the reform is a regulatory body, and Taumata Arowai came into effect last year. So Taumata Arowai are taken over as the water services regulator going forward. And again, that's already in place. They're already in effect, and it's already happening. And they are the ones that will be regulating this moving forward. The last pillar of reform, and this is the one that's still live and still going through legislation at the moment, is service delivery. So currently 67 district councils deliver water services. So that's drinking water, we talk about three waters: drinking water, storm water, and wastewater. And the service delivery component of reform is how should that service delivery happen in the future, and who should deliver that water reform and that service delivery in the future. There has been legislation already put through, and currently there is a bill going through Parliament at the moment, which is called Water Services Entity Bill 1, and that will give effect to a water services entity being set up in order to actually deliver that water service going forward. So there would be 4 key entities set up across New Zealand to deliver water services instead of the 67 councils as is currently in place just now. The details around how that will be set up and what mandate the entities will have is still being worked through, and that will be part of Water Services Entity Bill Part 2. And a lot of the recommendations that Brian will talk about later today will feed into that Water Services Entity Bill Part 2. Within Whakatāne District, we have been submitting on an ongoing basis for key concerns that we have raised and our community has raised as well. Those key concerns that we will continue to raise on behalf of our community are: how does the water reform tie in with all the other reforms that are happening? Provide a clear roadmap. The second concern the District Council raised was governance concerns, and how will the local voice of the Whakatāne District feed through into this entity? The third area of concern was how will this impact ratepayers, both from a cost and a service perspective? The fourth concern is that there is no funding for private water supplies to deliver against any increased or new regulations. And there was a concern, there's funding available for councils, but there wasn't any funding available for private water supplies. And the last concern that was raised is around what the impact is for whānau, hapu, and iwi. So we are continuing to submit on those key concerns that were raised, and we will continue to do that on behalf of the district. I would like to just introduce everyone to Brian Cadogan. So Brian is the Mayor of Clutha District Council, but also Brian was the Chair of the Rural Technical Water Supplies. And that was a fundamental group on behalf of the rural community, feeding in recommendations and concerns back through to central government, which has been fed back through already to central government through a recommendations paper. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of context and background to the Three Waters reform, and now I will hand over to Brian Cadogan to explain the discussions they had at the Rural Technical Supplies Group, and also how that fed through to a group of recommendations.
Just before Brian speaks, can I just ask everybody to mute themselves, and then at the end of his presentation there'll be a time for questions and answers. Or you can go into the, and at that stage, if you want to ask a question, can you just put up your reactions hand, the hand up, so we can see who wants to ask a question. If you'd rather put it in writing, there is a chat box that you can type a question into as well, which you're very welcome to do. So that's just sort of the process so that we can make sure everybody who wants to ask questions gets a chance. So I'll hand over to you now, Brian. Thank you.
Kia ora, Judy. Namahauri mai, and thank you, Whakatāne, for what I see. I thought it was going to be a real privilege, but looking at all these doer faces looking back at me, it might be a hard task. But hey, it is a real honour, and thank you for giving me the chance to have a talk. I looked up Whakatāne. I don't know too much about you, but a few years ago, Taumata District, we won the Trust Power Awards, and the Milapara, and what was the outfit? I wrote it down. The Milapara Youth Leadership Projects team got second the year that we got first, and we went out and had a pretty big night out with them, and I've often wondered how they're getting on. There are a couple of lovely ladies that, they were hard doers actually, but we had a great night out. But I want to thank you for giving me the chance to speak to you. Yeah, sure, it's going to primarily be around the involvement I had with the Rural Supplies Technical Working Group, but there's a bit more to that. So I thought today I'd just tell you my Three Waters journey, and hopefully from that you'll get a bit of an insight. I'll be able to poke and prod a few questions out of you. And also I want you to get the understanding, the background motivation for why I'm passionate about rural supplies and the distinct difference that they are to anything else that's wrapped up in the reform. I got morphed into this position more out of luck than management, and with the elections coming up, I'm not sure whether it's good luck or bad. I'm actually, my apologies for being in a Pratt outfit today, but I've got to get my pictures taken for the election profile. So yeah, we're in that mode. But I think all of us, we could sit around and have a blooming good argument about many focuses of Three Waters, and it's actually not going to do us any good. So what I wanted to do is that if I can hit my journey to you for the next 10 minutes, and then you get me back by being able to ask all the questions. So a bit of a background is, I chair the Lower South Island Zone 6. I also co-chair the South Island Three Waters team. I'm a member of Ngāi Takawai Representation Group, and almost as the last man standing, I had the real privilege late last year to be seconded on to chair the Rural Supplies Technical Working Group. And I only went on there for one blooming reason, and that was because I was brassed off about what was getting shoved down our throats, and I saw it as the only opportunity to have to actually put some sensible, workable solutions in. And they're the ones that actually reflected my district and your district's rural needs. But before that, though, going way back, when I first left school, my first job as a farm labourer was I was stuck in behind a D6 all through winter, putting the polythene pipe in as Clutha's rural water schemes got made back in the 70s. So I know the intrinsic historical connection that us rural people have with the water schemes because we built them. Later on in life, I shore my way into a farm. And you know, when you're new into a farming community and you get your farm first up, you get pushed on to your rural water scheme. And actually to me, and I think to every other member of the rural water scheme that I was on, the drinking water was just a Klingon. It was an ancillary thing. I wanted that water for the dry days when it was going to affect my stock. It affected my bottom line. It affected my health of my animals. And hey, yeah, I could throw some water over to the house, but it was only a Klingon. It wasn't critical to me. Another bit of background is I've been on council for 21 years. I've been mayor for 12 years. And over the last decade odd, there's been the increasing trend. There's just been this never-ending increasing need for all councils to meet the environmental standards, and it's just pushed. I don't know about you, but for Taumata District, it's just incessantly pushed our ratepayers in the urban districts way, way faster than they can afford. So the first thing that I want to make clear is the drivers and the dynamics and the total difference between urban Three Waters, your stormwater, water and sewerage, and your rural one water. And it's these different sets of dynamics and the historical connections, the perceived ownership, the direct governance through water scheme committees, and the day-to-day relationships that we have with our contractors. Rural has a far more intimate relationship, and it's essential to understand the difference between this and that technically disconnection, because I now live back in the town, and there is a disconnection. You just turn the tap on. For me, fundamentally, Three Waters is not my critical agenda. I love working with young kids that are unemployed or get burrowed into the prison, anyone that's vulnerable. Three Waters is not critical agenda to me, but I do believe that it's all of our critical responsibility. But let's face it, it's pretty hard to get excited about shit. Interestingly enough, my first awareness of Three Waters was 11 years ago when the then MP, Nick Smith, started a nationwide tour. He started down south and he came around to inform us what a bunch of muppets we were at our handling of the infrastructure and how he was going to take sewerage, stormwater and water off councils because we were absolutely useless. Sad thing for Nick was that at that time, it was exactly the day he came and saw us at the Distinction Hotel. He lost his portfolio for another matter and the whole thing disappeared. And at the time, I actually thought he was full of it. We were doing, we were the nuts guts. We knew what we were doing with our water. But I would have to say that over the last decade, you start hearing the whispers coming out of virtually every council. We've all got our Achilles heels. Let's put our big britches on and say it. There's always something going on. And combine that with the incessant urban rate increases, and you start to get that wider picture that sort of morphed into the reality of Havelock North. Now, I believe Havelock North, yeah, sure, it was a wake-up call, but it wasn't the only one. And so many councils were running the gauntlet that if it wasn't Havelock North, it would have been someone else. So on we move to the present iteration of sector-wide intervention. And time is starting to expose many councils. I think the 10-year gap, I've certainly seen a lot of councils in a more precarious financial position than we were 10 years ago. And there's a number of them that I believe that the game's already up. The costs and the work schedules they must undertake is already beyond their means. But as we know, when councils go under pressure, it's the pensioners and the financially vulnerable that pay the price. For Clutha, we're still a wealthy council. We've got about 30 million bucks in the bank, but it doesn't hide the long-term issues we have with our urban. We have 12 communities with 12 sewage plants and 12 water plants. We have the third longest roading network in New Zealand, so everything's stretched out over a vast area, and our population, our urban population's only 6,000 rateable units. We're poised over the next 10 years to push our urban along way, way faster than they could withstand. On the rural side, we have 13 rural water schemes, and they are monsters. Of all the 75,000 schemes, both private and council-owned in New Zealand, Clutha's rural water schemes are right at the very largest and most sophisticated, which up until now has been good, but it's causing real problems in these reforms because with the number of people that are clinging off them, they run the distinct risk that they were just going to get mopped up and sucked into the wider reforms. So that was my motivation. Thank goodness that we had the chance for the working group so that we can inject some practical local solutions that reflect our community needs. So from here on in, I will just focus on the Rural Supplies Technical Working Group's recommendations that stem from discussions and feedback that we got from around the country talking to our farmers. The whole group, there was 15 of us, primarily mayors, few CEOs were on the group, and we solicited our rural communities, and not surprisingly, we got the same message back. The concerns were similar. They were focused around 4 key issues, which was pricing, governance, ownership, and accountability. Now, obviously, with the various farming sectors, we'll get totally different dynamics, ensuring that one size wouldn't fit all. So we had to drill down. So from those 4 key issues, we drilled down, and that was how we made the 30 recommendations, because you can't have irrigation recommendations the same as what the stock or the cropping. I only had to listen to other members of the working group that came from the likes of Central Otago, where it's so dry and all they have up there is open water races and huge capacity for irrigation. They only have about 12 inches of rain a year, and if they don't use that water irrigation, that's it. They don't have any drinking water. Problem is that open races, the chlorine neutralizes within a matter of minutes. So totally different than where we are down in Clutha. I know that my farm had 2,000 litres a day, but my brother owns Mount Pizer Station up in Central Otago, and on a dry day, he can go through 13 million litres of water. So the recommendations had to be different. We also considered the needs that got roped in with it. We considered the needs of rural marae and Papakaianga, and we had to acknowledge, due to the historical inequities and the different timeframes available to this group, that we needed to consider and resolve their matters and give them their own space. So the group made a recommendation that we set up an ancillary, a further working party, strictly for rural marae and Papakaianga, that actually have people on it that are a better life resource than I was to be able to get the right solutions. So I hope that you've read the report and the recommendations and appreciate now the reasoning behind why I got excited and got involved with it. But I want to go through some of the key highlights before we hit the questions. So first up, there are thousands and thousands, 75,000 they estimate, private suppliers, and they do not transfer to the entity. I can't stress this enough. Private suppliers do not transfer to the entity. So we were only focused on the about 70 council-owned schemes. There is an opportunity that was put in. We put in the mechanisms and the recommendations so that if the rural water schemes wanted to go through the process of opting out, that was genuinely there. Now, I know that we've all heard of the opt-in, opt-out, and we could be skeptical, but I got a letter back for Whakatāne District from DIA yesterday that's going to allow my 12 monster water schemes to genuinely pursue the option of going private. I'm terrified for them. I don't want to see the water scheme chairs ending up in prison or the guys ending up with huge litigious risk. But that's what my community's wanting, so that's what they're pursuing. And I believe, Judy, you have one rural water scheme that's council-owned. If we can do it, you can do it. We're also determined that the starting point is that only council schemes are in the entity. So, stress once again, of the 75,000 schemes throughout New Zealand, 74,930 of them are private schemes. They don't come into this. At the end of July 2024, councils are going to be out of the picture. And I want you to think of this from your perspective as a council. You no longer have the staff with the ability to run your water schemes, and yet you're still going to have that water scheme, probably hoping that you will. So we had to make a call, and when it really came down to the crunch, councils by July 2024 will no longer have the means to run it. So consequently, they're out the picture. We also had those issues around pricing, so there will be no cross-subsidisation between urban and rural, and there will be no cross-subsidisation between rural water and urban stormwater or sewage. There are also many nuances and challenges that have to be accounted for in the recommendations because that one size doesn't fit all. I hope we'll cover this in the questioning. And look, really, I'm just going to throw that over and I'm going to go straight back to you, Judy, for some questions.
Cool. Anybody want to put their hand up and ask a question based on what you've just heard or anything you haven't heard? Gerard Van Beek.
Sorry, Bryce, I'd like to just clarify your last comments about cross-subsidisation, because one of the selling points that I understood earlier on was that for very small communities, huge infrastructural changes for water was going to be totally unaffordable. And so if we take a community like, we'll say, Clutha with 6,000 ratepayers, and you have to spend $1 million to go and upgrade something, that falls on 6,000 ratepayers. Whereas if you want to go and spend $1 million in Auckland, you've got 1.5 million ratepayers. And so the expectation there was that the larger pool of ratepayers would be supporting the poorer communities so that they could be uplifted.
Yeah, most definitely it is, Jared. And so that is with your urban. And we most definitely, there's going to be, so that was the first Water Service Entity Bill's recommendations covered that. So we're the second one that's coming in another month's time. But the first one for urban, most definitely there'll be a anticipated 5-year transition period, and then everyone will be paying the same. But the concern that came through from rural, and this is only rural, was, hey, are we going to have a water scheme that's only feeding stock, and it's pretty, not being awful, but it's low spec compared with the sophistication of the urban? Are we going to get mopped in with our urban and having to pay $2,000 a unit, and I've got 57 units. So we've dragged only the rural out of the picture, and there will be no cross-subsidisation between those 70 rural water schemes and anything that's happening across New Zealand. So sorry if I didn't explain that properly.
No, it's just you said no cross-subsidisation, but
Yes, most definitely the whole, the very essence of the reforms is, like for us to have 12 communities, 12 sewage schemes, 12 water schemes, 6,000 people to pay for it. And up the road, the only critical mass in the South Island is Christchurch, 400,000 people, earthquake, we all paid for their one water scheme and their one sewage scheme. So we're pretty keen to hold their hand. In fact, it wouldn't work if it didn't.
Cool.
Julie.
Thanks. Just with the difference that there is with the rural water supplies and obviously the urban ones, could you just elaborate a little bit more about your recommendations in regards to the governance of them and the differences?
So we had to take into account that, and here's me being presumptuous, all the water schemes that I know of have some form of governance through their water scheme committees. So you'll have a group of farmers primarily that will meet, and they will have that intimate relationship between the contractor and themselves, but also they will be coming back to council as it is now with their infrastructural management plans and their financial plans. As an urban ratepayer, we don't do that. We just flush the toilet. So there's that.
Yep.
And also quite, I don't know whether it's concerning or interesting, that there's the question of ownership. And I always felt we got taken to court as a council 3 years ago, and no one questioned who owned the water scheme. But now we're going through this, there's the question of who owns it. And we own it. Strangely enough, we went through our records and we could find no point where it categorically said, hey, farmers, you do the work and put it in, because we all, the ones in the 70s and 80s were subsidised by the government. The government paid 50% in cash and the farming community paid in kind through labour and the like. We can't find anywhere that it said at the end of all of this, it goes over to the council. So we've got DIA's lawyers on it. That was 2 weeks ago and they still can't find it. Don't know what that means, but yeah, so it's still, we're just going about it, the ownership or no ownership. There is the opportunity through that mechanism to opt out and go alone if you want, which hopefully diffuses the ownership issue. And yet it's a blimmin' interesting one, because you would have thought somewhere the government would have said, and give it over to councils. Can't find that wording.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting.
Terrifying.
John.
And the right button. Thanks for that. I think we read it before somewhere, but could you just clarify for me what constitutes a scheme? So if you, on your farm, if you've got 3 houses, does that come under this thing, or is it your own scheme that falls outside of it all?
So yes and no. So 3 houses, that will be a private scheme, but seeing as you're providing water to other people, so say you've got your farm labourer or someone renting a house, you still have to comply with the new water regulator Taumata Arowai, but you do not fall under the entity and the reform. So that you're part of that 74,930 schemes in New Zealand that have to comply with the standards, but are not involved in the reforms.
Thank you.
Okay, Andrew.
Thanks, Judy. I guess, Brian, yeah, mine follows on a little bit from John. Have we got an assurance that they will never come into being part of this? I mean, 75,000 across New Zealand, we've got between 1,500 and 2,000 in the Whakatāne District. Is there a genuine assurance that we will never, that those private suppliers will never become part of it?
So look, I know this is getting recorded, so don't let Bill Bayfield or Michael Lovett hear me say this, but there's a capacity issue that I'm seeing more and more, just the shareability. And even even the attitude that's evolved around our urban and peeling our urban off, it's just getting too big. Stormwater, you know, that LGNZ, and it's getting a bit of traction maybe. I don't really know how much traction, but there's just this ability to do it. So right at the moment, they don't have a dog show of being able to rope in the 75,000 private schemes. None of us can say what can happen in the future, but I do know that the legislation, the changes to be made for any genuine water scheme, so someone bigger, you've got to have 75% vote of members of connections. So it's going to be that first bill that's going to select committee now was more dealing with that. But it's going to be blimmin' hard to change things here on in. It would be really neat if there was a cross-party agreement on this. Yeah. But without that, well, we just have to hope. But that's a battle for another day. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty well beaten up over the battle we're having at the moment. Not looking for any more.
No, I quite agree, but there is that question being asked by these private supply owners, and it's a bit hard to say hand on heart that no, you will never be drawn into the reform.
Yeah, I know that the measures that the governance working group's recommendations did, they were trying to firm up around ownership of the bigger scale of the urban schemes. There's no intent. I've never heard of anyone that actually wants to drill down that much. And while it's a risk, in our lifetimes, something would have to fundamentally change hugely before it to become a true risk, wouldn't it? And that dim-witted brother of mine that's a mayor, he actually was on the governance working group, and I had a bit. He actually did a good job, and he came up with that idea around the. And I know that it's only sort of, I don't even know the right word for it. You know how we now have a share each, or I don't know how big you might have 2 or 3 shares for your size, but it is something that we can hold on to and go, you can't sell it, which is more than what we got. But surely if we don't want to do it now, what's going to change in the future for people to start wanting to do it? So I'm saying that there's just enough battle lines in front of me. And in fact, all the challenges I see for Three Waters are still in front of us. We've had such a hell of a time in the last year, but when you start thinking of the implications for the council, the transition, the financial structure, what's left at the end, all the issues are in front of us. The ones that we're dealt with now have been pretty easy, and yet we've done a god-awful job of handling them.
Thanks, Brian. I didn't want to bring your brother Tim into it, but I see you did.
No.
So
I don't want him ever to be brought into it, really.
Wilson.
Yes, thanks. And just to carry on from John and Andrew's questions, or 2 questions. One of them is on the private schemes. If farms are supplying water to 3 or 4 houses, staff houses, each house is on individual tank water, what's the status there? Do they have to comply with, have the testing and that going on, or are they individual houses?
So once again, I'm seeing a real practicality. The more I'm dealing with Bill Bayfield, he's a good practical guy. And yes, you've got to comply with standards, but then there's also got to be a practicality. Who's he going to look at more? Whakatāne Township or 4 houses out in the rural? So just the sheer burden of trying to get through it, he's going to look at the big ones. But I could see that you could have to put a filtration unit at source on your house. That might be an easy way around it, because the last thing you would want is somehow for there to be inundation, someone gets sick or even worse dies, and you're up for the scoot. So know that you're still under the water regulations, you still have to comply, and you wouldn't want to get caught out, but you're not going to get wrapped up into this entity and dragged into the major bum fight of that.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that. My other question was, we're talking about Three Waters and that, and we're talking about drinking water and sewage and that in urban areas, but we're only talking about drinking water in the rural areas. Is there no great plan for changing anything, septic tanks and that?
No. No, once again, the septic tanks will have to comply as they do now, but it's just a step too far. And actually, from an environmental point of view, what's to be achieved? So certainly it was nowhere on their radar, and we didn't talk about septic tanks. The focus was on urban sewerage is a real bugbear for costs. Water is the spike I have like north, and stormwater was the bugbear that it's just like, we know it's there, we know it's bigger than Texas, but it's sort of like the third cousin, isn't it? But are they going to drill down and start looking at septic tanks? That's nothing to do with this reform. Never heard it uttered.
Thanks, Brian.
Gerard.
Thank you, Judy. Mine, getting back to Bill Bayfield, and he says for single houses or houses on plural supplies in a rural area, it's, you know, a farmer with 3 or 4 houses. He's quite made it clear that an acceptable solution is an available solution. So it could be 2 filters and a UV lamp, and that would be compliance. But my bigger question is that there are some rural schemes in Whakatāne where a farm owner has the well, the bore, and he's delivering water to, let's say, 10, and I believe one of them locally is maybe even 38 people. And he's just sitting back and saying, I don't want the burden, and I'm going to turn my water off. And because he owns the water right, and he has the bore, and he has the viable supply, and the farmers or the neighbours that have gone and tapped into this viable supply are suddenly going to be taken down to their knees. What mechanisms are going to be set in place to protect people like that?
So I shouldn't put words in Bill's mouth, but Bill has taken practical measures and discussed it quite a few times with us. He believes that he doesn't want to turn off perfectly good supplies, quite rightly, because the one person that's liable doesn't want to take on that risk. So he's trying to find workable solutions, mainly around put the filtration unit on the side of each house, and it's the individual householders that has the litigious risk is at the point of entry to your house, and not the scheme as such. And that's the practical solution that I think we have to run with, because I'm blowed if I'd take on that risk. Somehow it gets in and there's inundation in your scheme, and next thing you're off to prison. None of us can take that on.
Thank you. Alison.
Thank you. Apologies, we've had a few challenges at the Mirupara Service Centre, and the question that I have is the rural food processors that have, and also have a house attached, they're already having a water management program plan that's audited yearly. Is that going to is there going to be another audit over and above, or are they just staying on their same plan?
I've never had that question asked of me, and that really brushes me off after I said I know everything. I'm going to take it that it'll be the water regulator that would have to be involved with that, and they're already up and running, so I can't see how the reforms would add another layer. But I'm hesitant to give that as a definitive answer, but that's how I would presume it would be.
There will be, well, according to the beekeeper that did actually give me this question to ask, hundreds of rural businesses in that position.
I might default back to Bill and get. Could I ask Bill and then get back to you, Jenny, and you put it through to your team, Judy, at least, sorry, because I've never had that. It makes sense to me that it has to be covered by the water regulator as it stands at the moment, and wouldn't be involved in the reforms. But I will just check with Bill on that one.
Yeah, but we could pass it on. That's not a problem. Did you have another one, Alison?
I was just going to say that there have been a number of comments that being springtime and the farmers very busy, it was difficult to get many online. to commit.
Yep.
So if there's another session, can we please consider the people the rural people it affects? Thank you.
Yeah, no,
I'm more
also-
than happy to come back for a second whack, Judy, if you thought there was the need. And we're the same as you, we're just stepping into calving and lambing. And look, when the select committee's on and we're rolling out of the select committee and we're trying to work with our 12 water schemes on this mechanism to privatise, that's going to take a hell of a lot of work. And DIA said, can we have it done before Christmas? You start thinking, well, there's an election which is going to cause us just a wee bit of grief. Then you've got all the rural issues that will cause them grief. And then it's December. But if we don't take this opportunity, the one thing that we are seeing is that come hell or high water, these reforms are driving to a schedule of October 2023. And that's it. The bulldozer's going and they're not going to stop.
Yep. Yeah, no, just for Alison, I know you've gotten a bit late, but we are recording this and it will be made available to anybody that hasn't been able to, for the reasons you talk about. And I'll supply that to councillors and people can either ask directly or you can forward it on out. So that's one thing. And then again, if we do have a need, if people feel like they'd like another conversation with Brian, I'm sure we could organise that in the future. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Jude. Just following on from what you've said then, it would be great if we could compile a Q&A, hard copy, that we can actually use as handouts to our farming sector, because as you rightly say, right smack bang in the middle of calving and what have you, and I think they've got enough on their hands with the wet weather and what have you. So it would be ideal if we could compile a Q&A out of that so that people could hopefully get the gist of what their problems are or answered through that. Thank you.
Yeah, look, has it been one thing that we've all found out about Three Waters is just the kerfuffle of misinformation?
Yes.
And it's real hard going at the moment. And I think it's critical that we as leaders have got to start trying to at least, I don't want to be in this position. The last thing you want rolling into an election is to put your head up too high. But if we don't put our head up, well, we're not really leaders. We've got a responsibility to do it. And it's a hell of a situation. But to stay quiet at the moment is going to be a huge disservice for our community. So we just got to do it. And especially around the rural, I'm really taking heart. I was really nervous when I took on this job, a Rural Supplies Technical Working Group, of why don't we just hit a brick wall like we did with the urbans last October and we're just getting mandated and shoved. But the letter that came through from DIA yesterday, I was astounded by it. The fact that we have got a genuine mechanism for our rural schemes to opt out, the pricing is tightened up, all the different recommendations are coming through. It's not perfect, but it's a downside better than how we would have been if we had got mopped into the wider. The rural could have so easily just been dragged into the wider reforms, and that would have been it. So, not many things in life are perfect, but we've got to try and do our best with the cards we've been dealt.
And I guess the other thing too is to say to people listening in that if you want to make direct contact with one of us councillors, either by phone or by email, with a question that you've got, we'll make sure that we get an answer to that for you. And that again, if we feel the need to be kind to Brian and ask him to come back and have another session so that more questions can be asked, and we'll try and find a better time. I think that you're quite right. That's one of the problems and one of the reasons why we have recorded this, so that we can pass it on as information. But if there's questions that haven't yet been answered in today's session, then we need to provide those opportunities. And I know that all the councillors on the Zoom are committed to that, as I am.
Can I
John,
also ask, Judy, just before we go to John, can I ask, did you FAIR get involved in the select committee process? We had our farmers putting into the select committee process. I did one, the council did one. And I think especially with the Rural Supplies Technical Working Group, so the time frame is that it gets presented to the House in about another 3 weeks' time, which must mean that the select committee will be 6 weeks either way. And the select committee is take a look at it, and if you don't like it, start knocking a few of the bumps off it, because that's our last chance. We have the working groups, then we buffer it up with the select committees, and then that's it. We're chewing it. So do get involved in the select committee process. We're charging on through, and we're actually going to put the verbals in for the first water service entity bill, because a lot of the governance around our urban is tied up in that. But I found it a really good process. The working groups, as I just said, came out the other end with a whole lot more benefit than I thought going into it. And if the select committee process can be as successful, while it's not ideal, we've at least done the right thing by our community and fought to insert the values and needs in the only way that we can, through the legislation.
Absolutely. John?
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Brian, the letter from the DIA that you're talking about, is that a public document, and are we able to have a copy?
I got it yesterday and I handed it out to my water scheme, so I've got it here somewhere. Can I check with Hamiora from DIA? I can't see why it wouldn't be, because he knew that it was going out to 180 of my water scheme guys. There's no secrets in there. They're just saying that, hey, we're going to have to work together. It's going to be a council, rural water scheme, DIA collaboration. We're going to have to go like hell. We're going to have to put a working group together. We're going to have to come up with the ground rules. And the most important thing they're saying is, if you're going to take over your water schemes and go private, we, council and DIA, have a moral obligation to make sure you've done the due diligence so you know the litigious and financial risk. Because while we've all been talking about how we're getting an asset taken off us, I don't know how you see your asset, but a sewage plant to me is endless cost and litigious risk. It's a responsibility asset, not a financial asset. And if my rural colleagues are going to take it on, we had a wee bit of a brush with the law and we got fined $500,000. It was a damning indictment on our council, and I'm peeved off about it. But Bill Bayfield said to me, you played that trick with me. You did that under the old public health. You play that trick with me and that $500,000 will turn into 15 million. And then I'll work out whether it's you or your CEO that goes to prison. Now, if we hand that over to our water schemes, because they want to hold ownership, they have to know that there's a water scheme chair that might just have his lifestyle tipped up on him.
Yeah.
If that's what they want, if that's what your guys want, but they have to know what the threats and the risks are.
Yeah.
So, if I may, Your Worship, we take out of this, Brian, that you can privatise your scheme and take the risk, I suppose, or it gets absorbed into the general thing, the general scheme of things. Is that where we are?
Well, what we're hoping to get, so the two options as I see it is that they go alone. The council no longer has the ability. We're losing our staff left, right and centre, and I have no doubt you will be too. It seems to be a nationwide phenomena. So for me, from a council point of view, our risk is not July 2024, it's July 2023, when we've lost so much staff, but we've still got a year to go. So, sorry, I digress. So the two options are go private, but that's nothing to do with council, or go into the entity, but maintain your governance structure. Because just as when we talk to Ngāi Tahu, they never talk about ownership. They talk about governance because they know that's where the strength. And I think that we're missing a huge trick here. And the fact that if you had all the governance strength and all the control that you could from governance, and don't pick up the litigious and financial risk of ownership, it's going to be interesting to see where my water schemes go. But that I do not say that it gets mopped into the entity the same as urban, because we would always want our rural water schemes to the water scheme committees to exist, and that connection between the contractors. What I'm hoping to get out of it is that so we've got 12 schemes in Clutha, and they're autonomous schemes. What I'm hoping to get is the chairs of the chairs, so that the 12 chairs come together, and then once a year the chair or a delegation would have a formal structure to go to the rural advisory group, or maybe even the regional representation group, so that they can take that higher end stuff, their long-term asset management plans, their financial planning for the 10 years of the like, they take it to, let's say, the regional advisory group, and that regional advisory group has a responsibility to come back to them with the answers, and if they didn't like it, then they can appeal as you can through the recommendations to the Ombudsman. That way the governance group has actually got some teeth. Otherwise, you know, all that we're getting in the South Island is, oh, we're going to get a bloody entity up in Christchurch. No one will know who they are. We'll never be able to get hold of them. We wanted to put real teeth into our governance, and that's how we saw it doing it, by putting a spike into that representation group, and then the Ombudsman if you didn't like the answer. So to say it's the same as the urban, no, it won't, because the urban won't have that opportunity.
Brian, can I just ask you, since the beginning of this journey with the Three Waters reforms, when we look at what was originally put out before us as the model, and with the work that Local Government New Zealand and other groups have been doing, and their sort of pushback at the government, do you think the level of change that has been able to be secured so far is sufficient, or do you think we have still got some concerns that need to be addressed?
There's a broad spectrum of opinion, isn't there? And there's some that are ardently just stop Three Waters. My concern is if we stop Three Waters from a New Zealand Inc. position, and I've been real proud of some of my colleagues that have stood up and said, hey, my council's done for. I was real proud of Tracy Hick to say that, hey, if we don't sort out Three Waters from a wider perspective, if Gore keeps Three Waters, we have to borrow 600% of our debt maximum right now. So how does the council do that? They just pass it on and hammer it. So we're saying, as I've said, when I got chair of the South Island, I felt I had an obligation to at least have a pretty good understanding of every council's position. So I went to their long-term plan asset management, their financial papers. Every single council other than possibly Christchurch and the South Island had an Achilles heel. None of us are big and tough. We're not as big and tough as we think. I know that as a politician, I could bow wave Clutha's situation for 3-4 years. We've got 30 million in the bank. I could be a gutless politician and I could mask it, but what the hell is that going to do long term? 12 sewage schemes, 12 water schemes, 6,000 people to pay for it. Even if we're brilliant, we're not going to get away with it. So it's not perfect, Judy. Nothing is. And I was real brassed off last October because we were gearing up to genuinely go to our public and have this conversation. Are we opting in or are we opting out? And I think with our financial position, we probably would have opted out and waited to see which way the wind blew for 3 or 4 years. If it worked out okay, we might have opted in. But as you know, you and all of us, we didn't get that chance. And it's left the public totally confused. It's left options for political meddling. I don't know where you are with groundswell, but you know, groundswell is where Clutha comes from. And there's a lot of misinformation that's out there. And really, as leaders, it's not perfect, but we're going to tie this one up because I keep going back and asking as many people as I can in central government, are they pushing through with it? Is the chinks in the armor? I haven't seen any chinks in the armor yet. They're going to drive through with this and it's going to be beyond the point of no return pretty much just after Christmas.
Yeah, I guess that's right at the beginning when I think pretty much all had some pretty were pretty appalled at what was being put forward and what we were expected to be part of. But over time, as we started to look at the standards that were going to be set for us and that we would have to meet on our own if this wasn't going ahead, the affordability issue becomes an absolute nightmare. Yeah. And I don't believe it's always because councils have done a bad job to date in terms of maintaining and upgrading their systems on a need-to basis, but largely because to meet these new standards, which are substantially better standards, if I'm honest, in terms of particularly drinking water, than we've ever had to be held account to before, in terms of health outcomes, the cost of us meeting those standards for our ratepayers, where we have the 4th largest geographic region for a council in New Zealand, funded by a small number of ratepayers relative to the size that we are, it gets pretty scary, I have to say, in terms of affordability. So,
Judy, what happened with us was, so we're a population of just on 19,000, and we got caught out with that. As I said, it really gutted me. A contractor, well, hold on, I better be careful what I say here. We had some problems with our sewage, let's put it that way. So we said we were going to be the exemplar. No more bell waving, no more peeing around and playing silly buggers. We're going to do it properly. So at last year's long-term plan, we assigned 141 million just to 3 waters. Now, we've never done that before, but if we were going to address the situation in our 12, the water plants weren't too bad, but our sewage plants were, they're bleeding money. So to get the 141 million with our population, and it was virtually entirely in the urban, we were pushing our urban along at pretty much double-digit increases every year for 10 years, which is unsustainable. In fact, it's morally repugnant. But even though we were pushing them that hard, we were still at the end of it going to have $62 million of debt. So we've gone from 31 million in the bank to 62 million in debt, and 62 million was an average sort of pain in the butt for a council our size. It wasn't too bad, but I certainly wasn't keen on it. A month after we did that, Queenstown did their application to discharge sewage to water, and it was turned down. 11 of our 12 sewage plants discharged to water. And that's what I mean by I could mask this. I know I could get away and no one would pick up on it. But if we have to convert 11 of our 12 sewage plants to discharge to land, we're down in the lower South Island where we've got heavy saturated soils. It'll cost us, I bet it'll cost us more than 200 million. So already we know that the dynamics are in place to meet the standards. We're going to go about 250 million. Our game's up. What do we do? So that's how I've always seen it, that it would have been, I would have loved to tell them where to smoke it, but I knew that I didn't have the answer long term. 250 million for a council our size, and then we're going to meet the next requirement and the next requirement. We've got to do the right thing by our communities. And a few years ago, my wife and I, when she got pregnant for the first time, I went out of work and we had to sell our house before we went bankrupt. I didn't like the deal, but it was the only deal I got offered, so it was the one I took. And that's, don't know why 3 Waters reminds me of that one. John, you've got your hand up.
John?
I have indeed. Brian, a couple of things. You just talked about the eye-watering amount of money for you guys. Someone's going to have to spend that. Does the government really understand what they're getting into? And the second question is, where is it all at with rural stormwater?
Oh God, rural stormwater. I better get to the first one. So I don't know how far and wide this is going, and I probably wouldn't like it to go all the way to Leanne Dalziel. But for us, for the South Island, it all hinges around a whole lot of small, you've got Southland District, Clutha District, Central Otago District. We're great, big, huge, expensive areas where no one lives. And the only critical mass in the whole South Island is Christchurch's 1 sewage plant and 1 water plant with 400,000 people. So that to me, and the fact that we're replicating, why is it that in New Zealand, every time we build a sewage plant, we have to go away and design it and get and blah, go through everything like it's the first sewage plant to ever been built in the world? Why aren't we going to it where we're getting that critical mass? And Judy's town, the same size as mine, and we get the same sewage plant. We're so inefficient at everything we do. So I can't answer that question because, let's face it, it's above our pay scale. But I know if we keep doing what we're doing at the moment, there's a few pensioners that are in for some serious, serious grief. Oh, and rural stormwater. Well, let's hope. I was told by a regional councillor that they wanted us to capture stormwater off all our roading network and treat it. We've got the 3rd longest roading network in New Zealand, so I'm hoping that he'll get moved on at these elections. That would be the best thing for it, I think.
That's cool. Ian, did you want us to wind up with any comments, or just, I just realised that we're nearly out of time, and I haven't seen any other hands up. So did you have any other final comments, or Bevan potentially?
Can I ask one question, Brian? So obviously when the Governance Technical Working Group submitted its recommendations, there was a formal reply back from DIA, and obviously a lot of the recommendations were then fed into the Water Services Entity Bill 1. Have you had any, two questions, have you had any heads up, apart from the letter you've received, around your other recommendations? That's my first question. And my second question is, every recommendation from these governance groups says there needs to be better comms. DIA need to step up and prepare better comms. Have you had any feedback on that recommendation specifically?
So firstly, around the recommendations, the first 43 recommendations that were picked up by the governance working group, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So we just, if we agreed with them, we just flowed on. So our 30 recommendations still had to be ratified. They went through a different process because, as you said, we were working hand in hand with DIA. We were reporting back to DIA, whereas the governance working group was reporting directly to the government. I would be really disappointed if all 30 didn't go through. I could see possibly there's one recommendation that I'm hesitant on, but I can't say because that would be unfair to the minister, but I'd be disappointed if our 30 didn't go through. And working with DIA, when they're agreeing and we're agreeing and there's general consensus, I'd be pretty peeved off if it came back some out of the blue that there wasn't. Yeah, and then what was the last bit of the question?
It was around the specific recommendation on communications. I think both the government's working group, yourself, lots of people have said the government's done a really poor job in communicating, and especially to the public, about this reform. Have you had any specific feedback on that specific recommendation?
We keep hearing that it's going to happen, and yet here we all going into an election and things are just quiet. And I don't know about you, but we're loading up on a heap of pressure here where you're the one that's standing in front of the howitzer at the moment. So the one thing I will counter to that is that it doesn't seem to matter what information goes out there at the moment. There is just a cacophony of contaminated gibberish that goes clean over the top of it, no matter what's said now. How would you ever, I can't quite see how any of us are going to get a sensible discussion going on these reforms. I just can't see how we can. And it did brass me off. So much of the pressure that we're going to be under in the next 10 weeks could have been avoided if the government had have gone through a different comms strategy, but they didn't. So what do we do about it? And actually that goes back to, I'm of the opinion that I'm going to be true to myself. I would love to not have to explain why I'm loading pensioners up with rates and the like. Who wants to talk about that? But if we don't, we contribute to the overall misinformation campaign. We've got to stand up somewhere, and if we own some of it, then let's own it. And I know that traditionally I've bow waved. I've bow waved because I saw it that I had an obligation to protect the people I love, like pensioners and vulnerable people. And we had an obligation to cut our cloth. Cutting the cloth long term is pretty much the problem that we've got now. And that's one of the things that I see is if we were to be honest with each other, is it the best structure that you can have to have 3-year politicians in charge of 100-year infrastructure? It is the genesis of where the issue comes from. And I believe that we do a good job in getting that balance between the community's needs and the environmental needs. But when you go to central government, the environmental needs are just getting ramped up. They're out of proportion.
Thank you. Bevan, did you have any comments you wanted to make?
No, sorry, I'm furiously writing down some notes. Thanks, Brian. I guess, so we've recorded the session and we'll make that available. We'll probably put it on our website and provide it to councillors to share as well. Any questions that you receive through your contacts and communities, pass those through to Ian and myself, and we'll make sure that those get answered if we can. And we'll look to take on Brian's offer for another session should there be some more interest, and we can find a suitable time that would work for farmers.
What we could do, Judy, also is we could get that brother of mine and him and I could tag team, because Tim's the spokesperson on the governance group and on the, so you get it, because if I have a fragility, it's around the governance ones. I'm only getting it second hand from Tim.
Okay, now that might be a good thing. So we'll look to that in the future. So firstly, Brian, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy person. Go and get some nice photos done for your mayoral campaign.
It's been a pleasure. Judy, just before we go, can I ask one question back, please?
Yes.
Because I noticed Alison, when she came in, said that she was from Mirapara, and I did ask earlier on, Whakatāne District, we won the Trustpower Awards, and the year we did it, there was a group called the Mirapara Youth Leadership Projects Team. Do you know them?
Of course I know them.
There was a girl with a full moko. Do you know who I mean?
Who was that? Excuse me, just a minute.
I can't remember the names.
Youth, I'm just asking here. Youth leadership team when they won the Horizon or the Trustpower. Who had the full moko?
My daughter and Ellie Mae Bradnock went on behalf of the team. Was it
Ellie Mae Bradnock, yes. Ellie Mae Bradnock and
Celine.
Pass on my regards to them, because we had a neat night
her
that night.
Celine's mother's here.
Oh, nice. Hello, mother. Pass on to your daughter my regards, because we did have a neat night.
That's
Oh,
good.
thank you so much. I will. Thank you.
That's good.
Hello.
I'm gonna finish now with just a karakia, and then we can all leave. So kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o te tātou āriki e a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te ātaua, me te whiwhinga a tahitanga ki te wairua tapu aki, amene.
Amen.
Thank you for your time, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.